I don't think the Italian inventor Marconi, when he invented the humble radio set in the 1890s, would have ever imagined that in the year 2020, an Indian man would be delivering a TEDx talk on his 2.5 decade work on the medium. I started my career in the mid-90s, a wide-eyed 18-year-old, working part-time at a radio station. My parents were dead against it. I mean, it's not as though they didn't encourage the arts. In fact, I was privileged enough to be put into music by them, sports coaching by them at an early age, and encouraged by them to dive into extracurricular activities, but only as a, mind you, extra. Not to divert from the primary aim of academics, and they envisioned a career in the civil services for me. Sadly, I went on to break their hearts, and also then to mend their hearts eventually in very beautiful ways with my success as a radio presenter and producer, and gave them untold joy that only parents can understand. It wasn't easy, but the two things that stood me in very good stead through it all were: one, my belief in exploring potential. Not only my own potential, but potential in others around me and potential in situations. Two, being stubborn about my choices. I followed these two mantras all my life. The early days of private radio meant, like private television, only the state broadcaster, All India Radio, like Doordarshan, broadcasting on one frequency and leasing out hours to private entities, akin to the government being landlord and private broadcasting companies' tenants. Those were the days of pure audio on the radio. And as a radio host, no one really knew how you looked like, unless the odd newspaper article came out with your picture on it, or you were asked to make an appearance at a live on-ground event. So very few really knew how their favorite radio presenter looked like. But they were able to visualize in their mind's eye and conjure up vivid images. In a lighter vein, I will always say that back then when people used to listen to me on the radio, because I did sound a bit like George Clooney, the Hollywood actor, with my baritone, they were led into believing that I also looked like George Clooney. Mind you, I did nothing at all to change that thought or myth. And that myth grew and grew till social media came in and shattered it. And they saw an overweight South Indian man sitting in front of a microphone. I was doing theatre, but I was willing to explore potential in radio when I was first introduced to it. I went about improving my radio skills, and I was stubborn about sticking to it as a career. Then in the late 90s, a curveball came my way. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting did away with the arrangement of leasing or renting hours to private players, and it went back to being just All India Radio. In other words, Times FM, Radio Midday, Radio Star, 6 o'clock FM were all retired from the airwaves. This was to be a precursor to actual privatization of radio, whereby tenders were floated and frequencies auctioned, so that each private broadcaster would have their own separate private frequency eventually. But as mere radio presenters, we didn't know the master plan at the time. The radio industry lost a lot of great talent. Some were re-employed in other divisions by their employers. Others went away and took on alternate careers as diverse as event management and record store management and television programming. I had already built a formidable reputation for myself as a performer, as well as a professional who understood music culture in this country. So the offers did come fast and furious. I explored the potential in most of them and decided they weren't for me. But while exploring potential in the field of voiceovers and voice acting, I did start to believe it was a slight extension of my work as a radio presenter. Though mind you, radio is more personality driven, and what shines out or doesn't shine out is your personality over the airwaves. While voice work is driven by your inherent voice and how you can bend and change your voice in different ways to convey emotion. So it's not about personality and your nature as a human being. I always tell people starting off, they seem aligned at the outset, voiceovers and radio, but they're not. They require at most times completely different skill sets, but that's a discussion for another day. Back to the real life story of this crisis in the late 90s, when private radio ceased to exist. At the time, I also used my second most well-used and practiced trait, the fact that I was stubborn about my choices after exploring potential in them. I used being stubborn to good effect and decided I couldn't leave radio. I went back to All India Radio and worked as a freelancer, an on-contract radio presenter and producer. The amount I earned back then was a pittance, and my loved ones were worried as to how I would cope in an expensive city like Mumbai with rising overheads. But because I explored potential in voiceovers and voice acting, I was able to supplement my income. Then private radio came back in the form that it exists today. And when it did, I knew I was ready and roaring to take the plunge. I was format and genre agnostic. I grew up and lived in 4 cities in the east, north, and west of India, thanks to my father's transferable job. And mind you, we're basically from the south. Hence, my ability to adapt to language, culture, region, and music came very naturally. So whether I worked at a Bollywood radio station or an English current hits radio station or a sports radio station wasn't the main challenge. The main challenge was to explain to the management, wherever I went, that I wanted to also be a producer and decide and create content along with being a presenter. For the layman in radio parlance, the producer of a radio show is basically the person who directs it, and the radio jockey or host or presenter executes that vision. Very early on in my career, I realized that I wanted a larger say in content creation, and I was not content just being the mouthpiece. I was happy to have other people to co-create with, listen to ideas and bounce off my own ideas, but not for me, just the on-air presence. I explored the potential in a producer's job and started mastering those skills, and then eventually just became stubborn about my choices. Mind you, when you wish to change or implore others to change, you meet with resistance. And my entire career in life has been about meeting with resistance and finding the appropriate ways to overcome or flow with that resistance. Now, in the year 2020 in India, we find all kinds of content on the radio. But mind you, in the early 2000s, Bollywood stations would only talk about Bollywood film songs, Bollywood film history, gossip, and center everything around the film industry. Likewise, English stations would talk about English songs, Hollywood film history and gossip, and center everything around being aspirational and what they called international. And it was believed that never the twain shall meet. I was the earliest content person to say in the modern era that a radio jockey has got to expand himself, think of himself as a radio journalist. The music is fine, but the radio presenter's content can be an individual entity in music radio. By way of an example, let's say you're listening to the radio. Song plays, song gets over, radio host mentions the song and people behind it. Then radio host switches themes to go on to talk about something completely independent. Could be current affairs driven, city related, consumer related, finance related, environment related, genuine stories of interest. Be a window to his or her listener's world. Post which, radio host switches themes seamlessly, introduces the next song to play with the appropriate credits, singers, music composer, lyricist, etc. And the song plays. I knew as people changed and purchasing power went up, content would have to follow suit in the new India. But there again, resistance. When I said let's do car reviews on the radio, have me talking to car experts comparing 2 SUVs or sedans, as in me, Hrishi K, as a representative of you, the listeners, asking appropriate questions so we can help each other make the right choice on buying vehicles. I was laughed at. The naysayers said, "It's not television, how will you show the cars?" I said, "Trust me, radio is the theater of the mind. And please allow our experts and me to paint a picture with words, and I'm convinced our listeners will soak it in." No one was convinced, but I bargained for 2 weeks of shows. I said, please give it a 2-week run, and if the response or feedback from our listeners is not good, we shall take it off. My weekly automobile show on the radio has been running for 10 years now. Then I mooted the idea of a tech and gadget show. Me speaking to gadget gurus and independent tech maestros and asking elementary questions on which phone or TV or printer or app is buzzing and what are the options before us. Resistance again. I asked for 2 weeks. And today it's a decade of my tech and gadget show. And every other radio station and producer is aping it or starting their own version. But you know what they say about imitation being the best form of flattery. Next phase. After exploring the potential for stand-up comedy in an audio medium early on, I was convinced and very stubborn in wanting comedians to come on every week. No one was convinced. You'll get us banned from the airwaves. all stand-up comedians use abusive language. It's a very digital thing. There's no visual engagement. Radio listeners won't be able to see the comedian. They'll get bored. Well, I heard all the naysayers out. It's important to give them a hearing. It's a very important part of exploring potential. And then I said, look here, I can circumvent all that. We will not have the stand-up comedians talking solo. That works in video mediums when they take long pregnant pauses. You can watch what they're wearing, their facial expressions, their hand movements, etc. But on radio or podcasts, you can't. So it's better if they do conversations with a radio presenter. I mean, you set a theme as opposed to a monologue, and it becomes an incredibly funny conversation between the comedian and the radio presenter. Also, we tape or record it as opposed to going live. So if they are creatures of habit, as we all are, and some bad words or abuse just slips out in jest, we're able to observe the radio code of conduct and delete them before putting them out as a broadcast. 10 plus years and counting of having comedians on my radio show, ladies and gentlemen, and people are loving it. There's more. When I suggested taking or talking finance and speaking to business leaders, I was met with so you're trying to be a CNBC TV 18, or you're trying to be an ET now, are you? Referring to prominent television finance channels. I also got, come on man, the radio audience is not that serious. They just want some fun and ambient listening, that's it. You're trying too hard, bas gana bajana. And I said, have you ever tried to give radio audiences that content before judging them and saying they will not respond favorably? Again, I bargained for just a few weeks, and today my Monday and Tuesday morning conversations with business leaders and finance wizards is the most sought after and emulated radio segment in the country. The point I'm trying to make is whether it's travel shows or even audio plays, the sky is the limit, because to me, radio is the theater of the mind. Now moving to the times we currently live in. As an extension to terrestrial radio came online radio. Streaming services, podcasts, audio shows online with or without music. Again, time to explore potential, friends. In times of the lockdown and the global COVID crisis, I've had actor friends of mine calling and saying, podcasts are the only thing we can do within the confines of our homes, so we're thinking of starting one. And I say, start it for the right reasons. Start it so you can sustain it, not as a crutch to get you through lockdown, and then give up on it when your primary job comes back on the rails and you get back outdoors to film again. That's called not being fair to yourself or your audience. Think of something that you might put out that shall add value to, first, your listener's life. That's paramount. And then secondly, your life. That's important. And don't think of yourself as a fly-by-night operator. It's disrespectful to both your audience as well as you. Let's talk radio versus podcasts in the modern era now. With radio, you have to align yourself to your listeners' values, your values, and the larger sum of the values of the radio station that you represent, or the radio network in which your shows are carried. With podcasts, you needn't worry about that, and only think of your listeners' values and your own value systems and what's important on those two fronts. In that aspect, there's a lot more freedom with podcasts. And now for the oft-repeated question, will radio survive the onslaught of streaming and podcast services? Oh yes, of course. Take it from someone who straddles both worlds comfortably. They shall always coexist. Let me explain coherently. Think of streaming services and podcasts as your own private car, and think of radio as public transport. They both coexist, don't they? And you decide whether you want to take your own car, if you have one, or take public transport, buses, autos, taxis, local trains from point A to point B. If you take your own car, you can pause and stop whenever and wherever you want. But with public transport, at least with local trains and buses, you only stop at predetermined points. They both coexist and have their own individual advantages. Let's move on to the challenges now. I don't know how many of you know this, but terrestrial radio stations in India are not allowed to carry political news. Unless it's taken from All India Radio, the government public broadcaster. This is a long-standing discussion that the radio operators in India have been having with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. In 2017, a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court questioned the government, and I quote, "There are many newspapers and TV channels which publish or broadcast news, and they're being regulated by the government. Why can't news content, which is in the public domain, be allowed to be aired on the radio? Why are you forcing All India Radio news on them?" Unquote. Now for the centre's reply through its advocate. I quote, Broadcasting of news by these stations may pose a possible security risk, as there is no mechanism to monitor the content of news bulletins of every such station, as they are run by private operators. Several anti-national radical elements within the country can misuse it for propagating their own agenda." Unquote. Suffices to say, my entire fraternity disagrees. You're basically saying that a TV reporter or a print reporter or a TV anchor working for a private entity can have an open debate on any political issue, from the India-China crisis to electronic ballot boxes, and disseminate news. But a radio presenter or a radio reporter cannot, unless he works for the public broadcaster, All India Radio. That's a challenge, ladies and gentlemen, a mighty challenge. But with all things in life, as with all things in life, our time will come. Only if we are willing to explore potential and are willing to be stubborn. Thank you very much.